Here's an example from Chapter 5 looking at taxes and trying to identify the amount of a tax and talk about the tax burden and how much of the tax burden falls upon the consumer and on the producer. So here's the scenario. The U.S. government decides to tax consumers of soda, or as people in Utah call it, pop. Before the tax, 50 billion cases of the best soda in the world, Diet Coke, were sold every year at a price of $4 per case. After the tax, 43 billion cases of Diet Coke are sold every year. Consumers pay $8 per case, which includes a tax, but the producers only receive $3 per case. And the questions that we might want to answer here is, what's the amount of the tax? What's the tax burden that falls on consumers and producers? And might there be a different way to assign the tax to get a different outcome? All right, now you might look at this, and this is, I think, a good test type question. You might say, okay, I can just solve this in my head, and what I find is that often leads to wrong answers. And so by doing it that way, you don't actually show your comprehension of the topics, and sometimes tears come as a result. So what I'm going to do is actually draw out on a graph what happens in the scenario of taxes, and then use that to help me identify correctly the different aspects of this. So I'm going to draw just a generic supply and demand curve with my School of Business ruler. School of Business, where dreams come true. I don't know if that's our slogan, but it would be a really cheesy one if it were. Okay, so here's my demand curve. Here's my supply curve. There's my equilibrium quantity, which originally was 50 billion. And the price was originally set at $4 per case. All right, now the scenario tells us that the government is going to tax the consumers. So step one is we identify this as a demand side. So we're going to shift the demand curve down. So I'm going to use my School of Business ruler, School of Business, where dreams come true. I'm going to shift my demand curve down. Step two is I find where the old curve meets the new curve, which is right here. I bring that down. Oh, I'm off the graph. There we go. Okay, so find where the old curve meets the new curve right here. I bring that down. That's my quantity under the tax regime, which is given to us as 43 billion. Okay, and now there's the 2 points, steps 4 and 5, say I take that quantity, I put it into the old supply curve, and that's the price that the buyer, or the price that the seller receives, and that is equal to 3 as given by the information, and the price of the consumer is 8. And so that's all the information we're given, and that's how we have it on the graph. And now we can actually answer these questions. So the first question is, what is the amount of the tax? Well, the amount of the tax is this wedge between the price that the buyer pays and the price that the seller receives. So that difference there is 8 minus 3. So that difference, size of the tax, is $5. Now that $5 is going to be placed on both the consumer and the producer, and that's what we call the tax burden, and that tells us how much of that new price that the consumer and producer pay and receive differs from the equilibrium price. And so if we look at this, before the consumer was paying $4, now they're paying $8, so the burden of that $5 tax that they share is $4. Well, we could just subtract and get that 1, or I can look right here on the graph, is producers were receiving $4, now they receive 3, so that burden is $1. So the burden of tax that falls on producers is $1. So of the $5, $4 is being borne by the consumer because their price went from $4 up to $8. $1 is being shared by the producer because their price went down $1. And that's how we get the tax burden. Now this last question, or the statement, is the effect of the tax on the quantity sold would have been larger if the tax had been levied on producers. Well, that's not necessarily true. If we look at the supply curve, if we were to shift the supply curve up by the amount of tax, then it leads us to this exact same outcome that we had before. So this would be a false statement. And there we have an example with our taxes being placed on the consumer. Moral of the story, please don't tax Diet Coke.